Okay, guys, so let's have a conversation about civil rights, specifically the civil rights movement. Really, the 50s and 60s is what we're talking about here. So, there's going to be a lot of dates and names and pieces of legislation that are going to be thrown at you in this conversation. So, just try to keep track of that in your notes. And as we go, make sure you understand, the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act and what each of those did, and then the contributions of the major figures. Also, don't be confused by the different presidents' names that we're going to throw out. So, we're talking about civil rights movement here as a topic, but we're not necessarily talking about it in like a 2-year span. The civil rights movement is long, so we're going to mention Eisenhower, we're going to mention JFK, we're going to mention LBJ. So if we just want to sort of think about it in context, Eisenhower is at the very beginning of this particular civil rights movement that we know of, right, in the 50s and 60s, post World War II, trying to restructure American society, efforts being made to make things more equitable. And Eisenhower is a slow mover when it comes to civil rights reform. JFK has some bigger ideas than Eisenhower when it comes to civil rights reform, but still doesn't move quite as quickly as many would like him to, in part because he wants to make sure Congress is with him when he moves, right? Let's wait for everyone to catch up and let's move together, because he knows that he has a lot of opposition to his agenda in the Congress. When he is assassinated, LBJ comes in, and it's really going to be LBJ that we associate with the passage of a lot of civil rights legislation. Even though that legislation might have been Kennedy's brainchild, Kennedy would never have been able to get it through Congress. But Johnson has two things going for him when it comes to getting things passed. The first is that at his heart, he's a legislator, and he knows how to speak to people in Congress. He has relationships, long-standing relationships with people in Congress, right? The second thing Johnson has going for him, and this is going to sound really horrible, but is that JFK was assassinated. And, all he has to do is sort of tug on those heartstrings of the American public and say, this was a program that Kennedy wanted. He was so beloved, especially after he was killed. So, LBJ is able to get a lot of the legislation passed that Kennedy would have liked to have seen passed. So Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson are going to be the three names that you're going to hear thrown out there in terms of presidents, and we're going to go back and forth a little bit between them. Here are some civil rights organizations that we're going to be looking at as we go. The NAACP, we need to know who Thurgood Marshall is. The Nation of Islam, we need to know Malcolm X. CORE, or the Congress of Racial Equality, James Farmer. The SCLC, we need to know Ralph Abernathy and Dr. King. The SNCC, SNCC, we need to know James Lawson, Stokely Carmichael, Ella Baker. And the Black Panther Party, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. So make sure that we understand what all these groups were, who was important within those groups, and what the key features of those groups were. And then again, some civil rights legislation. And both of these are images that are in the folder separately, so you can go in and look at them. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the 24th Amendment of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So we're going to be thinking about how different groups, these groups work towards this outcome. Going back to Eisenhower, really, and the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which is our first sort of baby step into this world of legislating civil rights. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 was designed to protect African Americans' right to vote. Eisenhower sends the bill to Congress, not expecting it to pass, but hopes that it will make the Democrats look bad, because Southern Democrats would refuse to vote for the bill, which he is correct in that assessment. LBJ will manage to get a compromise bill through, a Civil Rights Act compromise bill through. which we'll talk about. It will create a civil rights division in the Department of Justice, allow for court injunctions against anyone or anything interfering with the right to vote, and create a U.S. Commission of Civil Rights specifically designed to investigate instances where people had been denied the right to vote. We're going to be reading some documents, so don't worry too much where it says using both documents. But as you read those documents, think about whether or not you think JFK was a strong supporter of civil rights. What criticism does John Lewis have for Kennedy when it comes to the Civil Rights Act? So we're going to read those documents. There's John Lewis, right? Look at that young John Lewis. Of course, we know John Lewis, a very important American politician civil rights activist and politician who recently passed away. But if we want to talk really about the origins of the civil rights movement, we cannot do that without talking about and remembering Plessy v. Ferguson. Plessy v. Ferguson is an American Supreme Court case in 1896. It codifies the doctrine of separate but equal. It had to do with railroad cars, and the court says, yes, it's fine that you have railroad cars for whites and railroad cars for blacks, because as long as they're both being offered equal facilities, then it's fine. That is the law for a very long time, until a Supreme Court case known as Brown v. Board of Education overturns the doctrine of separate but equal and says that separate is inherently unequal, that there is absolutely no way to make separate and equal a reality. So Plessy v. Ferguson says segregation is okay as long as equal facilities are provided. That exists until Brown v. Board of Education says that is, a fallacy, that can't actually happen. And so it legalizes segregation. In the early days of the 1900s, as soon as the NAACP begins to exist, it starts to take a very unique strategy and a very, I think, brilliant strategy, which is this Supreme Court challenge strategy, that they want to try to get Plessy v. Ferguson overturned, that they're going to work in the courts to try to get laws passed through the court system and laws reversed through the court system. So you're not just lobbying for legislation in Congress. You're not just going to politicians and asking for change. You are challenging existing laws by making individuals into test cases. Linda Brown, the little girl in Brown v. Board of Education, her family knew what they were doing when they enrolled her in school. The Little Rock Nine, they do it on purpose. They enroll in school, challenging existing laws and saying, these new laws now are not being followed in southern states, challenging the federal government to do something about it. Rosa Parks sits at the front of the bus on purpose. There's this sort of myth that she just went in and she just plopped down and she just decided randomly that second that she wasn't going to move. It's all coordinated. And I think to suggest that it's not is to minimize the bravery of the people who planned these events out, really. And that's why Thurgood Marshall is so important, because as we'll learn in a second, he's this big lawyer for the NAACP. So this entire strategy that they have to challenge the legality both of existing laws and also, once those laws have been overturned, the enforcement of the new laws. It's really quite something, right? Let's see here. As you start to see an increase in African American voting, you also see a crackdown on African American voting. And so you see groups spring up to try to encourage more voting amongst Black communities, to try to increase political power for African Americans. This is where CORE comes in, the Congress of Racial Equality, and sit-ins and things like that. So we're going to mention all of these things. Oh, this is Thurgood Marshall. Again, an important legal mind of the civil rights era. He's the chief counsel of the NAACP. He focuses on ending segregation in public schools. That's his big thing. And I mentioned that the Supreme Court case of Brown v. Board of Education of 1954 is going to be what overturns separate but equal, overturns Plessy v. Ferguson. Chief Justice Earl Warren of the Warren Court, remember the Warren Court, he says, we conclude that the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. And in saying that, he ends segregation in public schools. It will become the basis by which all segregation laws are overturned. So little Linda Brown in Topeka, Kansas makes an incredible difference. Brown v. Board, as I mentioned, threatens segregation as a whole. It's not just public schools. But what happens is that, let me go back and slow down for a second because I feel like I'm talking too fast. Just because the Supreme Court said, hey, segregation is illegal, it didn't mean, because this is 1954, right? So why do we have the Little Rock Nine later? Why do we have James Meredith after that, right? This is 1954. It doesn't mean that the next morning, on May 18th, 1954, everyone woke up in the South and said, all right, let's take down our signs that say, whites only, and let's invite the African Americans in our community to sit with us at the diner and to come to school with our white kids. That's not what happens. In fact, white Southerners, not all, of course, but many, adopt a strategy on the second bullet point there in opposition to integration, and it's known as massive resistance, that they are going to deliberately not follow the new law of the land, right? Well, I don't care what the Supreme Court says. Remember what Andrew Jackson said? Marshall's made his decision, now let him enforce it. Okay, it's the exact same vibe that's happening here in southern states. The court had said that southern schools in particular needed to desegregate with, quote, all deliberate speed. Because many places said, we can't just desegregate overnight. This is going to take careful planning and consideration. So they said, all right, then just do it as quick as you can with all deliberate speed. Well, what does that mean? It's a license for people in the South who are pro-segregation to drag their feet for as long as possible on integration. It won't be until 1969 when the federal government says, desegregate immediately, desegregate all at once. And in the meantime, you have scenes playing out like this. You have that image in the top left. This is from a book cover called Massive Resistance, the White Response to the Civil Rights Movement. And then protest signs like the one on the right. I have lost 4 years of education. Why 5? Right? Because in 1954, you told me I could go to school. And it is 1959 and I'm still not in school, right? Notice also what she's written at the bottom of the poster there. Let's tell the Russians about this. Remember that we're in the middle of a fight for the hearts and minds of the globe. We are out there telling people around the world that we are a bastion of not just democracy, but equality and freedom. And you see scenes playing out like the one on the image on the left and signs like the one on the right. And it is absolutely used by the Soviets as propaganda to say to people in the Eastern Bloc, see, it's no better in America. They are discriminatory. We're not racist over here in the Soviet Union, but America certainly is. Look how it treats its citizens. So that's certainly something to consider. Bus boycotts and the importance of the church. Okay, this is Rosa Parks, and there's a little clip here from a documentary called Eyes on the Prize. We'll be watching a few clips, but Rosa Parks will refuse to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus and will be arrested. The civil rights groups will then call for a larger boycott of the entire bus system. It will eventually be successful. The boycott will be led in part by the Montgomery Improvement Association at the time, headed up by Martin Luther King Jr., who's a very young pastor and advocate for desegregation using nonviolent means. In November of 1956, we have another Supreme Court ruling saying that the Montgomery laws against segregation on the bus are illegal. It demonstrates that nonviolence can work. But notice she sits on the bus in 1955, December of 1955, November of 1956 is a Supreme Court case. The majority of people who rode the buses were working class folks in Montgomery. It took 1 year of commitment from African Americans to stop riding the bus and to hit their pocketbook. And that is one of the things that finally ends the practice of segregation. The church is really integral to, the Christian church in the South is really integral to the work of the desegregation movement. For example, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And in 1957, at the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, pastors there will emphasize the importance of voter registration. So the church will start to take an active role in registering African Americans to vote. I'm going to play a clip of Eyes on the Prize.
Like all cities in the South, Montgomery, Alabama had segregated buses. In interstate buses like this one, and in city buses, the whites sat in the front, the blacks in back. If more whites got on, the blacks had to give them the middle and back seats too. 3 months after the Till trial, Rosa Parks, a secretary for the NAACP, was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a bus to a white passenger.
And when the policeman approached me, one of them spoke and asked me if the driver had asked me to stand. I said, yes. He said, why don't you stand up? I said, I don't think I should have to stand up. And I asked him, I said, why do you push us around? He said, I do not know, but the law is a law and you're under arrest.
There had been arrest before. The black community was well organized and was now ready to respond. Leaders called for a boycott of city buses.
The people wanted to continue that boycott. They had been touched by the persecution, the humiliation that many of them had endured on buses. And they voted for it unanimously, and that meant thousands of people.
At regular mass rallies, the community constantly renewed its strength through song, prayer, and the encouragement of its ministers.
This show is your show. Not only is this show the show of Negroes in Montgomery, but this is the show of Negroes all over America.
The man they elected to help lead them was a new preacher in town, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was 26 years old.
We are not wrong in what we are doing. If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong. If we are wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong.
Before the boycott, 2/3 of the bus riders were black. After December 5th, there were almost no blacks at the segregated bus stops or on the buses. Many wondered how long would it take.
We thought that you could just shame America. So now America, look at your promises and look at how you're treating your poor Negro citizens. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. But segregation, you can't shame segregation. You can't, rattlesnakes don't commit suicide.
Month after month, the boycott continued. A wave of violence began. Shots were fired at city buses. Bombs were thrown at the homes of black boycott leaders, including Dr. King's.
Are you afraid?
No, I'm not. My attitude is that this is a great cause. It is a great issue that we are confronted with. And I have always felt that ultimately along the way of life, an individual must stand up and be counted and be willing to face the consequences, whatever they are. And if he is filled with fear, he cannot do it.
The boycotters rode black taxis. They organized a community carpool system. Mostly, they walked. After 11 months, it was the United States Supreme Court that finally broke the deadlock. The court ruled unanimously that Montgomery's bus segregation was unconstitutional.
The decision rendered by the Supreme Court yesterday was a victory. Yeah. But it wasn't a victory for colored folks. Don't make that victory that small. It wasn't a victory for 50,000 Negroes in Montgomery. It wasn't merely a victory for 16 million Negroes of America. That was a victory for justice.
We had won self-respect. And if you have never had the feeling to feel that this is not the other man's country and you are an alien in it, but that this is your country too, then you don't know what I'm talking about. But it is a hilarious feeling that just goes all over you, that makes you feel that America is a great country and we're going to do more to make it greater.
Oh, Lord, what a beautiful city. To the city.
Okay. So most of what we've talked about has been in the 50s, right? So where's Eisenhower? What is Eisenhower up to? Eisenhower believes, and here he is, here you see Dr. King on the left, that integration is going to happen naturally, that segregation will end on its own. This sounds so much like the argument that we heard a lot of people make with slavery prior to the Civil War. He worried that the nation would become too divided over the issue of integration, and we couldn't have that during the Cold War. He does work to desegregate Navy shipyards and veteran hospitals. He will also send troops to the South to protect certain African American rights, but it's a fair criticism of Eisenhower that he doesn't move fast enough or go far enough on the issue of civil rights. In September of 1957, the federal court ordered that Little Rock, Arkansas had to admit 9 African American students to Central High School. So this is the Little Rock 9, and there's a whole bunch of other little folders in this folder for you to look at about the Little Rock 9. What had happened was that the Little Rock 9 had attempted to register for school, and they were blocked. They knew they would be, but remember, 1954, Brown v. Board of Education. This is 1957, why can't I go to school? So they appeal them being blocked to a higher court, and the court says, yes, you can go to school because of Brown v. Board. So they say, Little Rock, you have to admit these kids to school. So Central High admits them. The governor of Arkansas at the time is a super racist man named Orville Faubus, who is not only a pro-segregationist, but a pro-segregationist who is up for re-election. He styles himself as this defender of white supremacy. He will call in the Arkansas National Guard to prevent these children from going to school. Eisenhower becomes furious at this, and he federalizes the National Guard, which means he takes the authority of the Guard away from Orville Faubus, and he instead commands the Guard to protect the students as they attend school. The federalized Guard will remain at Central High for a year, ensuring that the kids get to school every day, essentially, and home. So, this is an example of Eisenhower using troops for the purpose of desegregation. This picture up here, in the top right, where you see that woman screaming in the background, that white woman, this sears into my mind, right? Live your life so that you are not that woman. in a history textbook. That's just like probably a girl going to school. I don't know. Maybe it's somebody's mom. I can't really tell how old she is. But there is a story about that woman, and it's called the Scream image, and the young woman who's coming into school who years later reconcile, and that woman who's screaming there apologizes. And it's really an interesting conversation. They go on Oprah. So the whole community comes out every day as these kids are on their way to high school. So they had to fight hard to just go to school.
It was 60 years ago today that 9 African-American children entered an all-white high school in Little Rock after the Supreme Court declared separate schools for blacks and whites unconstitutional. Today, the 8 survivors recalled that milestone in civil rights history and said the battle is not over. Jerika Duncan is in Little Rock.
The memories of Central High School experience are always with me. They just sort of don't go away.
Melba Bills was just 15 years old when she became one of 9 black students in 1957 to integrate Little Rock Central High School. After an angry mob blocked them from entering the school, President Dwight Eisenhower ordered federal troops to protect them. The students became known as the Little Rock Nine.
The world came to Little Rock to see what would happen.
Minnie Jean Brown Trickey says the hate she faced 60 years ago took away part of her innocence.
One of the things I think that comes up is the fear, how we felt, and how we were so shattered.
Trickey says back then they weren't invited to the prom or other social events. But today the Little Rock Nine were welcomed back and remembered for their sacrifice and their strength, like when Elizabeth Eckford stayed composed despite numerous taunts aimed at her.
None of us talked about what it was like inside the school for 30 years.
Gloria Ray Karlmark remembered the last day of school and the message one white classmate left in her yearbook.
She wrote, "In a different age, we could have been friends."
Terrence Roberts. Do you feel as though we're going backwards?
No, but when you think about it, we're going forward very slowly because the forces of opposition keep pushing back.
For the Little Rock Nine, they don't celebrate themselves. They instead celebrate the possibility they still represent today. Jerika Duncan, CBS News, Little Rock, Arkansas.
9 very brave students 60 years ago. That's the CBS.
All right. Let's see what time it is. Sit-ins and freedom rides. So on February 1st of 1960, 4 college students will stage a sit-in at Woolworth's department stores. More and more and more begin to arrive after hearing about this. A sit-in is when you go into a restaurant and ask to be served, and you remain there even if they ask you to leave. Eventually, more than 300 kids will participate in this Woolworth's department store sit-in. The movement will spread to 54 different cities. I'm going to play for you. Well, here, let me finish explaining the rest of the text, and then I'll play the clip for you. In 1960, SNCC, which is the SNCC, will become involved during what's known as the Freedom Summer. This is the summer of sit-ins and the summer of freedom riders, where they ride. So after the bus, in 1956, November of 1956, remember, the buses were integrated, right, as a result of the bus boycott. But it, again, just like Brown v. Board, the laws weren't being enforced. So freedom riders boarded buses in the north on southbound interstates and then traveled south and refused to move their seats, right, to bring attention to the fact that the laws were not being followed in the South. They're met with all kinds of violence, including fire bombings. And in Birmingham, Alabama, the police superintendent there, well, I think he's the public safety commissioner. That's his picture up there on the top right. His name was Bull Connor. He says, "Damn the law, down here we make our own law." He is the one, if you've seen those images of police using fire hoses on nonviolent protesters, he is the one that is in charge of ordering that. I'm going to play a clip for you that involves the use of the N-word. So if that bothers you, fast forward through it. It's original footage from training. So what these are sit-in trainings and also training for the bus rides, where you would go to CORE or you would go to SNCC, SNCC, and say, you know, I want to volunteer, I want to be a Freedom Rider. So you would have to practice your response to violent situations. What if someone's in your face calling you a name? You have to stay nonviolent. What if somebody grabs you and pulls you out of your seat? You cannot fight back. That takes a lot of emotional fortitude and something that the belief was had to be practiced. And so you're going to see that, but you are going to hear some language.
Supreme Court ruling, long ignored in the South, that bans segregation in interstate travel. The plan is for black and white volunteers to ride together on buses. Journeys that CORE calls Freedom Rides. The riders commit themselves to nonviolence.
I want you to think it over very carefully, and if you
believing that challenging segregation peacefully will force the authorities to act.
We would be very happy to have you embark upon this dangerous, worthwhile, significant mission.
CORE prepares the riders for the racial hatred they can expect.
Hey, you, nigga. You hear what that man said? You hear what that man said? You get back there. Get back there. Get back. Hey. Come on. Get back.
On May 4th, 1961, James Farmer leads 13 people, black and white, onto buses in Washington, D.C.
There's so much smoking in these videos, isn't there? Don't smoke, y'all.
10 days later, the bus enters Alabama, home to the largest KKK organization in America.
And also to Bull Connor.
They know the riders are coming. In Anniston, the Klan surrounds the bus, slashing its tires. Photographer Joe Postolione captures these images. The crippled Greyhound tries to escape, but a few miles out of town, the Klan surrounds and firebombs it, with the riders still inside. The Freedom Riders do escape the bus, only to be beaten by the Klan. Joe's photos bring the Freedom Rides to international attention.
All right. Oh, well, I could have enlarged that for you. And I think I'll stop here, and then when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about Kennedy and his civil rights record.